Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your film. We have a nice period of over 20 minutes for a conversation. I'd like you to be part of the conversation, so do raise your hand if you have a question out there or thought on the film, but I'll begin with a few questions for Luke. Thank you for joining us, Luke, and thank you for your film.
Thank you, Luke. Seriously, thank you for
Too many Lukes here.
for bringing the film here. Yeah, it really means a lot.
Firstly, I wanted to ask a kind of, I guess, a more general question. This is a space that needs really a lot of trust, both trust from your protagonists, the Ochoa family, and also the patients that are within that space. It's a space of real intimacy in terms of the lens and the closeness that you have of representation, but clear kind of vulnerability too. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you built the trust with the family to tell this story.
I think the first part of my answer is that it came gradually over a really long period of time. We shot for kind of on and off over the course of 3 years, and I spent almost 90 nights in the back of this ambulance, sometimes starting at 2 in the afternoon and shooting until 7, 8 in the morning. And each night I found myself just becoming more a piece of the fabric of this business, and also learning how to shoot the film and learning how to connect with the family. And I think I knew from the beginning that my main job was going to be to connect with them, and that the film would come once that relationship was formed. And in the last week of shooting, about 70% of the film was shot. And I think that was because the trust and the relationship had gotten to a point that was richer than everything that had come before it. So it was a long process. Yeah.
And speaking of kind of learning how to shoot the film,
Yeah.
it is very unique in that the majority of the drama, majority of the material takes place within this confined space. That must have created a lot of restriction in terms of your creative freedom. Could you talk a little bit about the way that you had to, I guess, navigate that environment to include some things but exclude others?
Yeah, I think what kind of made the visual style of the film possible was that it was, despite being a chaotic space, it was a controlled space, and one that was very repetitive. So I was able to make mistakes and fix them the next night that I was there, and that kind of happened over the course of the 3 years. And the early footage that I shot looks nothing like the later footage, and so it was a process of experimenting in a way that I don't think I would have been able to do with a story that was only going to happen once. Enable me to kind of pick the visual language and then stick with it. And I ended up creating a system where there was kind of one camera mounted on the hood of the ambulance and another camera in the back, so I could cross cover between scenes, and these kind of complicated equipment rigs that would never have been possible if it didn't all take place in one vehicle. Yeah.
And we're in the UK here. We have a national health service. The story of the kind of privatized ambulance was very much news to me. It was something of a revelation. I wondered if you could give a little bit of a context about why there are so few ambulances that the government are funding. Is it simply economics, the cost of it?
There's not a simple answer. I think ambulances are, not something people think about regularly. If you need one once in your life, that's, a lot. And I was surprised that after discovering this system, I went and talked with people involved in government and, all sorts of people in Mexico City, and nobody knew about this. And I think it's a system that exists the way it does, the way a lot of corrupt systems exist, where there's people keeping it that way that are benefiting from it, and it's hidden enough from public eye that there's not kind of an outrage. And people like the Ochoas have kept the city from being kind of a total disaster. So that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it's a kind of informal solution to this issue in a way. But
exactly, yeah. And I think something like 60% of people employ themselves in in the informal economy. So this is what I thought was a really interesting example of a family that made work for themselves in an industry that, in the health industry.
But it doesn't necessarily feel like so sustainable for them. It feels like there are long periods of, hard graft
Yeah.
and then stagnation in a way that no income, a lot of investment to run the ambulance and feed a family. Is it something that you think is there a future for the family in this industry?
Um, I, Actually, it's gotten even tougher for them since we stopped filming, and it got so tough in terms of their relationship with the law and police officers that they've stopped going to accidents entirely, and now make most of their living just doing hospital to hospital transports, which is just a safer setup. The money is more predictable, maybe not as big when it happens, but they kind of called it quits on really what you see in the film. I think it's an industry that they got into when it was a bit easier for these ambulances to stay afloat. And while I was filming over the course of the 3 years, it kind of felt like the government was maybe trying to crack down on this industry more than they had in the past. And they kind of had put so many of their resources into getting the thing started that it was hard for them to kind of get out in a way.
And speaking of the kind of corruption, obviously we see quite explicitly the police demanding bribes, creating these quite arbitrary rules of to regulate, but also to I guess to bribe the ambulance drivers. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your feeling when witnessing these scenes, not only of the police transactions, but incidents where arriving at a hospital, there's a demand for money.
Um, it was kind of fascinating to witness it because you see, I got to know some of these police officers and I would be filming them regularly. There's one that I actually kind of filmed quite intimately and decided to kind of keep the scene just in the distance. But you see the story from their angle as well, and you think about it, it's just kind of $5 here or there. Who really cares? And then later in the night, you kind of see it unfold in its fullness, and it's people's lives that are really at stake when a police officer sends an accident to one ambulance versus another. And so I think part of the film, there's a lot of different kind of stories in there that I was thinking about when making it, but part of it was trying to show how street level corruption, these very small transactions on a daily basis, slowly make their way into people's life and death. And that was something that felt really important to me to capture.
I'd love to invite audience questions and thoughts, if there are any out there. There's a lady at the back on the right-hand side.
Hi, I was wondering about how when you were filming the victims, the patients, how do you think about that? Because they weren't giving you permission in the moment, or how did you go about all of that?
Yeah. Like building trust with the Ochoas, it was also a process of kind of figuring out how I was going to film in this ambulance, what my kind of ethical limits would be. And I started out the first kind of month of shooting was just in the front of the ambulance and not even going in the back. And then the more time I spent in the ambulance, I found that there were moments where I could get consent before accidents or could connect with these families in a way that felt right to me. Still, even far into production, I was kind of pulling the plug and turning the camera off in about half of the accidents that we would go to because it didn't feel right or a family member or patient asked me to stop. But I was continuously surprised by the number of people, family members or patients in the ambulance that were comfortable with me capturing these moments. I kind of assumed that anybody in an accident would immediately want privacy, and that wasn't the case for about half of the people that I filmed. The accident that you see at the end of the film was something that I filmed in that first month of shooting, and it was something that I captured really kind of naively without knowing that a family member would get in the front of the ambulance, and I almost deleted the footage kind of after that moment, but I saved it and I kind of let myself think about it for a while and showed it to a old film professor of mine who encouraged me to go find that mother. So about 6 months after that accident, I went and knocked on her door and spent a couple hours with her talking about the film. And her daughter was a journalism student, and she gave me permission to use it, kind of thinking that it was something her daughter would want to do. So that's maybe one example of me trying to really connect with these families in the best that I could, and setting kind of rules for myself in terms of when to stop and when to keep going. But every accident was completely different, and I think part of the reason that I wanted to shoot it as a one-man crew was to kind of keep that responsibility to myself, and be able to pull the plug when it didn't feel right, but also sometimes push myself in moments when it maybe did feel all right, which was also kind of uncomfortable, but would often pay off in ways that felt okay. So it was one of the big challenges of
Yeah.
making the film.
Thanks. Can I make a follow-up?
Yeah.
Just in
Yeah,
terms
sure.
of access as well. Do you think the fact that you're not Mexican, was it more difficult for you to gain that trust, or maybe even easier? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I can tell you that I feel like the Ochoa family at times had a similar interest in me as I did in them, and that there was kind of a foreignness to this American guy who was interested in hanging out with them. And I think, had I been a journalist from Mexico, they would maybe have thought about the film in a different way. That maybe would have been a there would maybe be a barrier there, and that they would be less curious in who I was. I don't know. There's obviously barriers in terms of me being an American going and telling a Mexican story, and I think that's a complicated one that I tried to overcome with what I was talking about in the beginning of really giving myself 3 years to figure out the story and connect with these people. But I'm a firm believer that those barriers of culture, of language, slowly come down with time. And yeah. So I think I could have been Mexican and spent the same amount of time and gotten there, but it would have been a different journey.
And
Thank you.
it's obviously it's a portrait of this informal system and political corruption in Mexico City. But at the same time, it's a portrait of a family. And I felt through the film that dynamic with the family and the emergence of the son as a protagonist. He's clearly much more entrepreneurial and has perhaps a brighter future ahead of him. Did you find did you find more affinity with him through the filming, or was it a conscious choice to begin to kind of look for further dynamics within the film?
I think it took a while to really make the decision that Juan is kind of the protagonist of this film. There were cuts where Josue was the little 9-year-old was maybe the main character, and there were cuts when Fer, the dad, was the main character, and a lot of that came down to kind of technical things of when we were editing, of having a great scene, but maybe Juan wasn't the one at the middle of it. And it took a while to get scenes where kind of in every accident or every important moment, Juan was at the center of the scene. But the family dynamic was what actually interested me in the story to begin with. The reason that I asked the Ochoas if I could check out their ambulance was because I saw that it was this family-run business, and this was before I knew about the kind of underworld of for-profit healthcare that the film ended up being about. So it was something I was really interested in, of how a kind of ragtag family works together in this nighttime world. Yeah.
Are there more audience questions out there? There is a gentleman in the middle. We can't see you very well, so I'm guessing. What do you look like? Yeah.
I was wondering about, you had a point where you were following a different ambulance crew, and sort of when you made that decision to include their part of the story as well, and also were there any other ambulance crews you followed that you just, there wasn't an interesting narrative there?
Yeah, there's. Are you just referring to that one scene where they're talking to another ambulance crew?
I maybe misunderstood. I thought there
Okay.
was a point where we had another crew involved, but maybe I was confused by the people involved.
Oh no, the Ochoa family was the first ambulance that I filmed in Mexico City. Through filming with them, I met, I think, the majority of private ambulances working at least in this kind of 3 or 4 neighborhood heart of the city. And I'm so grateful that the Ochoas are the ones that I found. They have kind of a charisma and a warmness to them that wasn't as visible in some of the other businesses. And I knew that kind of sinking this story in these ambitious people trying to do the right thing was a really important piece of showing the darkness of it too. And there's other ambulances in Mexico City that aren't as well intentioned, and I think that would have been a much more difficult film and would have kind of kept me, I think, from exploring a lot of the complexity of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did you get a sense that there are other services that are, much more corrupt than what they're doing? And is there any relationship with the hospital that they take them to? Is there almost like a commission to take patients there?
Yes, they do work with that hospital, and that's kind of a big piece of how their work sometimes gets complicated. And in terms of other businesses out there being more corrupt, I think there are other ambulances run by 15-year-olds who don't really, have the setup that the Ochoas do to even think about what's right and what's wrong. And this is also, just in a kind of the wealthier center of the city, and I imagine in other parts of Mexico where I didn't spend time, that the situation is maybe even more dire.
There's another question at the back there, the gentleman in the black t-shirt.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could sort of comment a bit more on the ethics of this commission-based system they seem to have with the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to sort of like push particular hospitals, and I was just wondering, like, were there any points where they were doing that where maybe that wasn't in the patient's best interest?
I think what I wanted to show with a lot of these ethical questions is that it's a system in which nobody's really getting what they need to survive. And this family is pushed and pushed and pushed to a point where they don't really have the luxury of always doing what they might want to do, or always doing the right thing, you could even say. So, from very early on, I knew that this film would be kind of a series of accidents where each accident, these ethical questions get more and more twisted. And it was something that I felt very vividly when I was on board this ambulance, was that we would save a baby's life and then show up to another accident and do something to make money that maybe didn't feel as great. And it was this chaotic world where I was pulled in all these different directions, and it was kind of heartbreaking, especially since the more I got to know the Ochoas, the more I kind of trusted them in kind of a strange way. And it took cuts and cuts and cuts of the film to be able to show how complicated things get while saving that feeling I had towards the Ochoas as ultimately people trying to do the right thing. There were cuts that made them seem like total demons, and then cuts that sugar-coated the reality of things, and it was really hard to kind of find that balance.
Thank you.
There was another question just on the left here.
We have a series in Britain called Ambulance, which is really popular, and they have one shooting PD on that program and 3 locked off cameras. I was really intrigued by how on earth you managed to get the coverage you did, bearing in mind there was not 2 people in the ambulance, there was 5, including yourself and the 9-year-old. So how did that actually work? Where were you most of the time?
I spent most of my time, so there was, most of the time there would be a camera mounted on the hood of the ambulance, and then I would have another one in the back. But then there would be nights where I would just have one camera and kind of be crawling between the front of the ambulance and the back of the ambulance. But it was, yeah, I mean, being in those 2 spaces, I was really able to kind of get what you see. It was a lot of, like, making a film like this is a very physical thing. I would get home at night and just be kind of like scraped up and covered in kind of dirt, because I was like running across the highway to get a wide shot and then running back into the ambulance. What kind of saved me in a way was there was a side door that I would have access to that was separate from the door that patients and paramedics would use. So usually when we would arrive to an accident, the first thing I would do would be to pop out the side door and get kind of a wide shot that I knew would kind of cover the first few minutes of the accident, and then figure out, A, if I felt comfortable filming what was actually happening, and then B, kind of where to begin with that. But it was months and months and months of figuring out how to be in the right place at the right time.
There was another question on the left here. The gentleman, yeah, to the back there.
Thanks. Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that was like one of the most visually stunning films I've seen this week, probably, and definitely the one I'd watch from the beginning again straight afterwards. So thanks in general.
Thank you.
In terms of your kind of like development over the 3 years in your building of your style and things like that, how did you decide the amount of time it would take to kind of get to that point? And I guess, yeah, if you had obviously had less time, would you have started the project, or?
It's a good question. We actually, it's interesting to me how, like, the process of making a film, you're completely lost and then you look back on it and it's so obvious. But we had a locked picture that we actually submitted to Sundance and a few other festivals actually a full year before the film was actually completed, and we didn't get in. And then the producer of the film kind of called me after we didn't get in, and we had this really long conversation that, he kind of asked me, I think we have a solid film here, but is it really the film that, we wanted to make from the beginning? And it, left this kind of pit in my stomach for a week, so long that I kind of eventually knew that maybe it wasn't the film that was there. I always had this really confident feeling in the Ochoas and the world that they worked in as being capable of carrying a great film, and we just weren't there yet. So we decided to take a whole nother year. I went back for one last shoot, and in that last shoot, we shot about 70% of the film. And I think I kind of knew that we had it, because while I was shooting, I kind of had just an index card, and I was just kind of structuring out the film every time I would get a scene that filled this idea that I always wanted to communicate with the old footage but never could. And so I went back home after that shoot and kind of put together the structure of the film in a week, because I had been thinking about it so much and just didn't have the material. But I always dream about spending another 5 years in this ambulance, what kind of film I would be able to make, but you got to move on sometime.
Maybe there's a series in there somewhere.
Yeah.
There's a lady at the back on the left there. With a question.
Hi there. I've got two questions. Very briefly, how did you meet them? Just out of curiosity. And then the second one, I know you spent 3 years back and forth, but how many hours or gigabytes do you think you shot?
I had moved to Mexico City kind of right after graduating from college, and pretty spontaneously met the Ochoa family just parked in front of my apartment building. And like I kind of said, I was curious because I saw Josue and I saw Juan and I saw this family dynamic, and I kind of am always looking for stories. And so I asked them if I could ride along. And on that first kind of night, it was like, holy shit, this is a movie. And then how many hours did I shoot? I think it was probably something around like 400 hours, which, yeah, sounds like a lot, but I think that's what we needed. Well, no, that's not true. I think the first
For the first cut.
the first 250 of those hours, I think I was learning how to be a filmmaker, like learning how to make a movie. And then, like I said, in the last week, I had finally learned how to make a movie.
Great. There's a lady standing at the back there.
I've got a couple of questions. Do the Ochoas have any medical training at all? And also, was it traumatic for you because you must have seen quite a lot of blood and guts in the back of the ambulance?
The father in the family kind of got into this world through working as part of the Mexican Red Cross and got trained through that organization, and then eventually broke off and got this kind of expired ambulance shipped down from Oklahoma, with which he opened up shop. And he's really been the one to teach the rest of the family what they know. In terms of the experience for me, I mean, yeah, it was totally overwhelming and heartbreaking, but also kind of exciting. You would be sitting on the street corner, it would be 5 a.m. and you would kind of weirdly be hoping for something to happen, and then like the moment it does, you kind of fear what it might be. And it's this, you really get pulled in all of these directions. And I think I had the luxury of kind of hiding behind the camera in a way that the Ochoas didn't. And I also could kind of get out when I felt overwhelmed and could take a break. I think it will hopefully kind of remain one of the more overwhelming experiences of my life.
Were there any scenes that you arrived at that you just felt, I can't film here? A lot of the patients are as a result of kind of road accidents. Is that because of the kind of information they're getting? Would another police department deal with, I don't know, kind of domestic crime or drug violence or whatever?
I think they respond to pretty much everything, though it does depend, like you said, on kind of how friendly they are with certain police officers. But I think they really get to most accidents, and it's kind of an interesting, you kind of have your finger on this pulse of the city in terms of what you see. 80% of what we responded to was alcohol or drug related. A lot of car accidents, some kind of violent crimes, a lot of diabetes related stuff. But there were moments that really stuck with me that maybe weren't cinematic or even communicable at all. Like maybe a few words exchanged between a mother and a daughter that, just stuck with me. Or some mental health stuff too that really was shocking, but wasn't something I wanted, that was easy to explore in the film because you couldn't really see it. So yeah, I mean, it's the perspective that you have on the world from this ambulance is something I wanted to share with you all, but is also there's, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg in a way.
Well, thank you very much for your film. That's all we've got time for this evening. Please put your hands together for Luke.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us.